Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. I'm the co-host of the show, Kyle Anslone, and I'm joined by the other co-host, Will Porter. Will, how you doing today?
What's up, Kyle? How's it going, man?
Pretty good. I think we got a pretty good middle of the week show for everybody today. Another coronavirus update, some news on Iran, and Israel gained a whole bunch of control over the U.S. government somehow. So we'll talk about all that. And yeah, a bunch of interesting stuff on today's show. Make sure you share it. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute or on social medias at Twitter handles at the Will Porter or at Kyle Anzalone _. And make sure you check out the YouTube page, Conflicts of Interest, subscribe to the show, and you get the great video feed with the news ticker and all the other articles and, kind of visual aids we use to enhance the show. So be sure you're checking that out. And Will, let's go ahead and get into this.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, the latest coronavirus update that we have is about actually them starting to, Supreme Courts at least, strike down a couple of these COVID executive orders and regulations that have been put in place by different governments. We've discussed in the past on the show how these things are extremely, oppressive and have a lot of times been the cause of shutting down businesses and stuff like that. So, Will, I know that one of these big decisions came down in your state, and I'm wondering if you just notice if everything's free and the masks are flying off outside, or if things are pretty much the same as they were last week.
Yeah, it's a revolution. We've all been liberated. Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't seen any visible changes or differences. However, I think that there's some dispute over when this actually will come into effect. However, last Friday, as you're saying, the Michigan Supreme Court actually struck down all of the Governor Gretchen Whitmer's emergency orders related to COVID that were issued after April 30th. And their reasoning was because Whitmer was required to ask the state legislature to extend her powers after the first temporary emergency declaration she did in March, and they did, but they only agreed to do it through the end of April. And so they're saying that the court has ruled that she's trying to exercise legislative powers that that should be reserved for the legislature as the executive, and that's unconstitutional. And so therefore all of her emergency declarations after April are illegal under Michigan law. And this is a pretty rare. It's one of the first rulings of this kind that we've seen in the post-COVID era. There hasn't been a whole lot of judicial pushback at some of these lockdown measures, but that is what we're seeing here in Michigan. And Whitmer has just been extending the emergency order over and over again. The first time that she imposed it was March 10th, and the last time she renewed it was just last Tuesday, so just a week ago. It was just a few days before the Supreme Court ruling, actually. And so she's had these emergency powers for 7 months straight now. And in the meantime, too, she's issued a bunch of dozens of other smaller executive orders, that aren't quite as major as her main emergency orders. I couldn't possibly remember all the things off the top of my head that she's done, but it's a lot of things you've seen in other states in terms of limiting gatherings. At one point, she tried to prohibit just private residents from visiting each other. You couldn't go to another private dwelling. Not that I think that was enforced very heavily, but that is the type of authority that the government is claiming, the governor is claiming that to have here. And it seems like she just wants this stuff indefinitely. She's argued that so long as there's COVID and there is an emergency, and presumably that means she thinks that she should just have these powers forever, I guess, until there's no more virus or something. And so, as you might expect, the governor has condemned this ruling. The court has a conservative majority, so you'd expect her to be pretty hostile toward that. However, she's claiming that the decision won't take effect for another 3 weeks, and she's saying that she will keep the orders in place until then, until the very last moment she has to. However, it's not really clear where she's getting that. I don't think the court said anything about 3 weeks or 21 days, and I don't think anyone really knows where that's coming from. She's just claiming that it's gonna the court ruling won't come into effect until that time. However, after just claiming that in a statement, she's now actually requested the court to give her until the end of October to figure something out to lift these orders. But I don't think they've actually decided on that request yet. So it's not really clear when exactly this stuff is supposed to be enforced. And like I'm saying, I haven't actually seen anything I haven't seen any stores get rid of their mask signs or anything like that, because I believe the mask mandates would be included in that. Anyway, so next, though, the next step is that the legislature may decide to reimpose some of these restrictions and measures, with an actual bill, with actual legislation. So it's not totally clear. It's not necessarily the case that like all of these restrictions are gone for good. However, the court has, for now at least, decided that the governor cannot keep this emergency powers indefinitely for months on end, even if there is a pandemic. So I guess that is like a good precedent that we've gotten here from this. It was the state Supreme Court, but nonetheless a pretty high level court.
So, there's a lot of interesting stuff there, especially for me to ask you about Michigan, just because I felt like, at least in Massachusetts, when I lived there through the time where, there were quite a few cases right at, kind of the start of this whole lockdown thing. But as time went on, for the most part, the mask mandates and all the government regulations around COVID remained the same. And that really didn't have a lot of, it didn't seem to have a lot of dependency on what the COVID numbers were, or, people seem generally even unaware if, COVID was serious in their area, and if that at all, impacted how they were wearing masks or what businesses were open, what kind of businesses were allowed, to do business and stuff like that. And so I'm just wondering, throughout this, as you mentioned, she's had these executive powers that she just granted herself, and they seem fairly abusive for the past 7 months. It has, as COVID has waned, or whatever, has she relaxed those orders, or has it been kind of what I think we both expected at the start of this with government power? And I think ultimately that, the prediction that me and you have made on our first like coronavirus update show, of foreign policy focus, which is once the government started to get involved in this, there was no way they were going to really roll back these authorities and powers, and would keep all the coronavirus measures in place for as absolutely long as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what the political economist Bob Higgs calls the Ratchet Effect, where the government always like aggrandizes more power to itself and never gives it up. So all these supposedly temporary powers, it's become basically permanent, or at least longer term than they were initially supposed to be. And that is definitely something we've seen with Whitmer. I think she has like a couple times like slightly tweaked some of the rules, like scaled some things back a little bit, like oh you can now have your business at 60% capacity instead of 50 or something. Like I think there have been little scale backs, but like mostly no, like they've continued like the major the most intrusive orders about like closures and bans on public gatherings and stuff. And so no, I would say that Whitmer has not like given up authorities, as because our outbreak actually had a nice like it peaked in April. Michigan's numbers were the highest in April in terms of like daily cases and stuff. And then we had like a lull over the summer. Things kind of went down a little bit. And more recently, we're seeing another like minor spike again. But when we had that lull over the summer, it didn't seem there was any like, movement away from some of these powers. It doesn't seem like the government is really like, it's not dependent on that. Like you were saying, it's not dependent on the COVID numbers. It's sort of just like, however they want to portray the situation. And I do think they have some kind of like guidelines and framework for reopening, phase one and phase whatever. But I think there's a lot of ways they can kind of game that in terms of like what data they're looking at and, just that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah. I noticed some people on Twitter were talking about that essentially the cases in their area had, gone down significant numbers, to the point where there was like 2 or 3 people hospitalized in the entire county. And yet it
Yeah.
hadn't like left like, stage 2, which it had been in since July. And I'm sure this has in part something to do with the fact that, a lot of people seem to be getting tired of some of these COVID lockdowns and regulations, and that they don't really seem to reflect the reality of the situation. So if it as it got worse, they imposed more strict lockdowns, but then as it waned a little bit, they start to lift those regulations as they went. My guess is more people would be willing to follow what was in place, but because it seems like it really never goes away or anything, it doesn't seem, I think, to reflect the reality of the situation a whole lot. And so
Right.
I'm sure that's, making it more likely that, people aren't going to go by this. I talked to somebody who, made the point that the worst thing we could have right now is a real actual pandemic that's very deadly, surface, just because everybody's going to kind of be like, well, the last one wasn't anywhere near as bad as they said it was, and if we go along with it, we're never going to get it undone. So let's just
Right.
do our best to to ignore this. The other thing I want to talk about is just my move. I've gone from the East Coast. Now I'm hanging out in the Midwest for about a week, and just to say that there is a pretty strong difference of how people are seeming to respond to the virus in different states. I obviously haven't been in Missouri for the past 7 months to say, oh, this is about the same as it's been before, but I gotta say there's south of where I am right now, Jefferson County, Missouri, it seems to be like a complete COVID free for all, where I see hardly anybody wearing a mask. Just talking to a couple of my friends who live in Jefferson County, unless you're going to the Walmart or Home Depot, you don't really have to wear a mask. Other businesses aren't requiring it. Nobody's really asking for it. When I stopped at different places across, when you're in the East Coast, it was like everybody had a mask on. By the time I made it to Ohio, I stopped at a rest stop and walked in a gas station where half the people weren't wearing masks, including a couple police officers who were in there, and the store employees. And then, I think like by the time I got to Indiana, at best somebody had on a chin diaper and nobody was actually wearing a mask at all.
Right.
So, they have like the chin strap on to let you know that, hey, we got a mask, but,
It does absolutely nothing.
right. And so just looking at how kind of things are going and everything. And I think from the CDC numbers this past week, cases in Missouri have dropped well over 10%. And so I would say that people should really be looking at this and trying to consider, like, maybe the masks aren't that big of a deal, or does everybody really have to wear them, especially if you're in a more rural community and stuff like that? And also, what does that mean, for our ability to keep businesses open? I don't think anybody is anywhere like really considering that maybe we need to start considering like least restrictive measures and stuff like that. Like, what can we pull back to give people, a little bit more normalcy, social interaction, all the things that humans really need to thrive. And since the COVID death rates really aren't that bad, especially if you're under the age of 70. We see a lot of the numbers in the 0.000 whatever percentage range, where let's start looking at some ways to get things back going. And rather, it seems that everybody is just especially in more democratic blue states and with democratic governors, just the most lockdown absolutely possible is the goal. And by what you said of Governor Whitmer, like trying to say, oh yeah, this will take place in 20 this won't take effect for 21 days, and just crazy stuff, just asserting that that's the case, that they're going to do everything they can to hold on to this power and keep people locked up for as long as possible. It's really crazy that they're all these businesses, all these people, all these lives are being absolutely ruined. And I guess as long as they're not ruined by COVID, that's absolutely fine for all these governors and stuff like that. It's crazy.
Yeah, part of me almost wonders if they scaled back some of the restrictions, if they'd get more compliance. It kind of reminds me of the whole idea of like the Laffer curve, where like if you raise taxes above a certain percent, you won't get more revenue because people just won't comply with it. They just won't pay. And so I wonder with some of these restrictions, like the more strict they are, some people there might just be a threshold where people are like, forget it, dude, I'm just going to completely disregard this. Whereas if they were more reasonable, maybe you would actually end up with more compliance. I don't know. I don't know if it's the same kind of incentive structure as taxation or whatever, but I could see that being possibly the case.
Well, I mean, you would think so, at least in the case where the office of the governor of California, I believe it was that Twitter account. It was the verified Twitter account and everything.
Yeah.
Tweeted out that you're supposed to be putting the mask on off in between bites of food. Like, this was their serious recommendation, that you're sitting at the table with people eating, right? And you got to take your mask on and off for different bites of food. It's baffling that anybody would think that that's something that people would do, or that if you're eating food, if you're like taking the food from the fork to your plate and sticking it in your mouth, and somebody at that table has COVID, like it doesn't matter if you put your mask on in between bites, like you're sticking food in your mouth. You would think like maybe like ban breadsticks or something like that, like these shared food things.
Don't
Um,
give them any ideas, man. You're gonna give them that's gonna be the next hashtag.
one of the
Ban
craziest
breadsticks.
one of the craziest things I've seen is in the St. Louis County, Missouri. There's a particular thing that I believe the like city I forget manager, whatever that title is, put in place
Right.
that they can't serve fountain drinks at gas stations. And so now everybody has to get their drinks out of the cooler, which means everybody's touching the handle of the cooler. I don't
Yeah.
understand how, that would be a particular risk where, taking a cup from the cup dispenser and then, just handling your one cup and putting it under the fountain drink thing could possibly more of a risk to spread COVID than everybody touching the handle. Or now everybody has to go through the drive-through line at McDonald's and stuff. And so if you have one McDonald's employee that would be sick, you would think it would spread a hell of a lot more than, just everybody picking up their one cup, from the fountain drink thing at the gas station. And so it's
Right.
just rules like that that seem so random that, as you said, probably with the kind of Laffer Curve mentality that you're not going to get a whole lot of compliance on some of these things just because it seems made up and stupid. And why would anybody, follow made up and stupid rules, especially when, as we've talked about in the past, there are a lot of real consequences now that we really don't understand or know the impact of in full. But when you look at like suicides, overdoses, divorces, different kinds of domestic abuse are all, known to be in some case on the increase. I think I saw for the first time they estimated that veteran suicides were up 20% over the course of this lockdown. And so even if that's not reflected, directly by the the number by the total population, it's likely going to be higher. And so we're talking about a lot of lives. Also, whenever the, third, fourth, fifth, sixth order effects hit the, world and global economy, they're estimating hundreds of thousands, if not more, children are going to be, put into like the hunger, starvation, medical care. They lose that, and then now they risk dying.
Right.
There's just so many kids in the world, and not just the ones starving to death in Yemen. I'm talking more generally about, kids in Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and stuff like that, who legitimately just like from poverty and, trying to get resources to them that are on the brink of, life and death. And so if you have major hits to the world economy like we've taken, it's going to have a major impact on the number of kids who die in these areas. And so, it'll be interesting to see whenever, the worldwide statistics come in, probably not even the next 2 or 3 years, but years down the line, and you kind of look at what the hit in the world economy that we've taken over at least the past 6 to 9 months here is going to have on, the just the poverty rate, and then the excess death rate, and how many kids under the age of 5 are dying and stuff like that. I think that's going to be a very disturbing number. And I think for a lot of people, it's going to be something to look at to say like, hey, maybe lockdowns aren't the solution to a virus like COVID.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing people living in like sub-Saharan Africa and stuff, living like a hand-to-mouth existence where like they make $1 a day. They make as much as they need to eat that day. And some of those countries are trying to do these lockdowns too. And it's just like that's insane. You're gonna end up with such a insane amount of like what they'd call collateral damage. That's kind of a cruel way to say it. But like, the impact on real human beings' lives is real of these lockdowns. And fortunately, here in Michigan, we have seen some of the first action to strike back at some of those powers. We also had something in Pennsylvania last month where it was on a different level of government. It was a federal judge, but nonetheless, they similarly struck down Pennsylvania's lockdown orders, saying that you can't declare whole swaths of the economy non-essential and you can't ban public gatherings. That's simply unconstitutional. And so we have had a couple rulings in the last couple of weeks that have sort of started to strike at these lockdown orders.
Right. Yeah. How interesting would it have been, Will, if Trump had tried to capitalize like on COVID to shut down the Black Lives Matter protests or something like that, claiming that these events are spreading the virus? How maybe then like the First Amendment would have somehow had taken and had an impact in all this, but
Right.
largely that didn't happen. And so now these are finally being struck down, and it is the importance of being able to go out and protest and have life and freedom, and that the government can't all strip away from you. But Will, anything else on COVID here?
No, I mean, there's like endless news and endless things to talk about with it, but I think we covered the stuff we plan to discuss.
Right. I guess I just want to mention Donald Trump is out of the hospital. So
Yeah,
that, was a kind of a big update in his COVID story. I saw he tweeted out that he expects to debate Biden next week. That he says
yeah,
he'll see him in Miami. So I don't know. We'll see. He says he's doing great after taking uh Remdesivir, I believe is the drug that he ended up taking.
yeah.
And
Remdesivir, yeah,
yeah, I mean all the controversy surrounding his like little drive around to wait to the supporters, and then
yeah.
him saluting the Marine One helicopter and it being called a Mussolini moment. I gotta say that the Democrats here are overplaying their hand so much. They may just hand this guy the election win by how over hyperbolic they are about this. It's not a Mussolini moment, even if he's being
Thank
like
God.
a little bit of a showman, and that's not exactly what you want from your politician. He's a reality TV show host. He's not a fascist. He's not Hitler. Like let's be real here, but you won't get that reality from MSNBC. Anyways, Will, let's take a moment here to talk about our sponsor, Paloma Verde. They sell the great CBD products, and if you go to the website palomaverdestore.com, not only can you buy their CBD products that have absolutely proven lab results and are all legit and produced the right way, but you could get an education on CBD and what it could do for you, how it could help, how different taking it in different ways for different things could be helpful. And so if you're interested in CBD but you're not really sure maybe what products to buy or what you could get, first of all, feel free, if you're a listener of the show, to message me and I could, personally tell you, hey, this, is how I've been using it and how it's worked for me. Or you could check out the Paloma Verde website and get a pretty good idea of a CBD education, how it all works. And, as me and Will have really highlighted, the reason that Paloma Verde is the place you need to go for your CBD is because they do this stuff the right way. Their products are lab tested, so you know exactly what you're getting. And if you use the code PEACE at checkout, you'll get 25% off orders of $75 or more. So that's palomeverdestore.com. Links are on the YouTube page and at the show notes page at the Libertarian Institute to make it easy to click through. And again, use the code PEACE at checkout for 25% off. Will, let's get back to the show.
All right, man.
All right, so we have some more news on these Iranian oil tankers. The U.S. is, doing its best piracy and seizing some different ships of Iran, and they've now seized 1.1 million barrels of that fuel, and I believe they've now offloaded in New York, right? So that is officially pirated from the high seas and now in the U.S. And this is a pretty interesting story, Will. So I think you have a little bit of the bad story here as to how this cargo ship was seized, and what maybe will happen to this oil now that the U.S. is apparently willing to just steal anything on the high seas that it thinks shouldn't be going to where it's going.
Yeah, so this story is like a couple months in the making now. We actually covered the original seizure of these tankers back in August on Foreign Policy Focus, your old show, and I also wrote about it at RT when it first happened. But a few months back, the U.S. grabbed these 4 tanker ships that were carrying over, as you said, 1 million barrels of gasoline that originated in Iran. And at the time, the U.S. was saying it was executing this forfeiture warrant that was obtained by federal prosecutors a few weeks prior to the actual seizure. And the government was accusing the Iranians of selling this fuel to Venezuela so that they could then funnel money to the Revolutionary Guard Corps, this elite Iranian military unit that the Trump administration has actually designated a terrorist group. And so that was the U.S. government's original justification for all of this, is this alleged link to the IRGC and this alleged sales to Venezuela. That's where they said this stuff was headed. So they seized those 4 vessels and then they transferred the fuel from them onto 2 bigger ships. But those 2 ships have been in sort of like limbo because of a legal challenge that was brought by the owners of the fuel. Actually, it's a couple different multinational companies who own it. These ships were originally supposed to dock back in Texas a couple weeks ago, but they've been unable to do that because of this legal stuff, these legal issues, and they've just sort of been floating around for a while. But last Thursday, finally, the first one was able to dock and discharge in New York. Um, However, that was only half of it. The other ship is still out there, like floating off the coast of Texas in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm not really sure what is supposed to happen with that second one. We had Reuters reporting last month that it was like preparing to dock and offload that fuel, but that's like the last you see of it, is that they were preparing to do it, in at least in mainstream media coverage. If you go and look at some of these smaller like shipping news websites that are kind of like niche, they continued writing and reporting about this, and that ship never did dock. And you can actually go look it up. It's a Liberian flagged ship called the Euroforce, and you can just Google that and see its present location. And as of like 8 hours ago, the last time I checked, it was still just hanging out there off the coast. So it's not really clear what's supposed to happen with the other half of this gasoline. Um, However, I mentioned that legal challenge from the owners of the fuel that was seized. And interestingly, they actually claimed that the fuel was not headed for Venezuela at all. So like there's like a real direct challenge to the US government's story here, their whole narrative. The companies claimed that they were on their way to Trinidad and that they were going to be selling the fuel to customers in Peru and Colombia, but not Venezuela at all. They say they weren't even headed there. And I don't claim to know the veracity of those claims. That could just be them, like, trying to make up a cover story for themselves. But nonetheless, they are disputing, these companies are disputing a central part of the US government story here. And the Iranians have done similar too. They've also like disputed the American story. And they say that the ships weren't theirs. And that's true. They are Liberian flagged ships. They're not actually Iranian flagged. And the gas, they say, was no longer theirs when it was seized. And so they're like disputing the whole thing about that, this is Iranian fuel being shipped to Venezuela, because they're saying this was like not even a concern to them at all. They didn't own the ship, they didn't own the fuel. So like this is not an issue affecting Iran at that point. So that's sort of Iran's side in all this. And so there's been like, a couple serious challenges to the US side of the story in all this, like where the fuel is heading and who it belonged to, and basically all of the most important parts of the government narrative. However, even if the fuel was not headed to Venezuela, let's just assume that the Iranians and these companies are correct. The Iranians do sell fuel to them, to the Venezuelans. Like they say they do. They've admitted that. And the U.S. has been demanding that they stop. And so this seizure is basically a part of that, this like pressure campaign to try to stop these fuel sales to Venezuela from Iran.
Yeah, and I believe I read this week that Iran had actually gotten 3 more tankers carrying only a couple hundred gallons of fuel in total to Venezuela recently.
Yeah.
And so I guess the U.S. Maybe isn't seizing those ships for some different reason. Do you have any idea on why these particular ships were targeted versus other ships that have been allowed to go to Venezuela? Which it could potentially be interesting if these ships weren't headed to Venezuela and for whatever reason the U.S. is only picking on ships that are carrying Iranian fuel but not actually owned by the Iranian government for a particular. I'm not sure. Maybe this is a way to try to cut Iranian oil without upsetting Iran too much. I'm not sure. It just seems like a very dangerous precedent to set for the U.S. First of all, to essentially be pirating this oil. I mean, they just go and they see ships and they take it in a different direction. Yeah, overall, I mean, I think at the time we noted that this was a very provocative move, but it seemed like the Iranians were trying not to make too big of a deal out of it by saying, hey, the fuel's not ours. And as we've seen, that the challenges haven't come from Iran, so I guess maybe that is a little bit of the reality of the situation. And I don't know, anything on that, Will?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure why the 4 tankers that were seized over the summer. I'm not really sure why they selected those, because there have been, at least as far as we know, I think 2 like fairly large and successful Iranian fuel shipments to Venezuela this year. You mentioned the one that just happened last week. That was like I think like 800,000 barrels of oil altogether, or gasoline. And then there was one in May as well for 1.5 million barrels. And so it's a little bit odd that they wouldn't like that's a fairly large shipment that they wouldn't have stopped that. Despite their demands and sanctions and all that stuff. And so I'm not totally clear why they went for those four in particular. I don't know if maybe they found that those they had good intelligence on those ones and they kind of knew where they were going to be, or whether it was a mistake and they actually thought that was still Iran stuff and that it was going to Venezuela. Maybe they just weren't informed about the situation, or these really were Iranian shipments, and I don't know. That just happened to be an opportune moment to seize them. It's not totally clear why they've allowed some through and stopped others. But yeah, we have seen at least one attempt to stop these shipments. Now, again, we don't really know for we have a lot of he said, she said here. The companies are claiming that they didn't really bring it to Venezuela. They weren't even bringing it to Venezuela. The Iranians have their own story about who it actually belonged to. But if we just take the government at their word, the U.S. government at their word, then yeah, this was an attempt to stop one of these fuel shipments to Venezuela. And an interesting thing about Venezuela is some people may be aware that they're a fairly oil-rich country, but they've had gasoline shortages, and that's because they're unable to run a lot of their refineries. Whether it's because they don't have the parts for them, the U.S. sanctions might prevent them from getting some of those parts, and I think there's also just issues of poor maintenance and underinvestment and stuff. I think there's several reasons for this, but regardless, Venezuela is not really able to run its refineries, and therefore it has these huge fuel shortages, and that is what Iran has been trying to sort of make up and help to compensate for. And I think the Venezuelans usually give them gold bars in exchange, so they're just giving them this hard currency for the fuel.
Right. I think at one point Turkey was actually helping to facilitate those gold transfers to Iran, which is interesting for so many things, including Turkey being a NATO ally. But yeah,
Right.
I mean, again, I think the reason this is a big deal and why we need to talk about it is just because if the U.S. Were to take another Iranian ship, we could see something similar to what happened when the UK seized the Iranian supertanker off the coast of Gibraltar, crossing into the Mediterranean Sea, where once that ship was taken, the Iranians then seized the UK ship and created a little bit of a hostile standoff for a couple months. And I definitely think that's an event that can be replayed if the Iranians feel like they need to take action to prevent Americans from stealing ships with their oil headed to places that they needed to get. Um,
Right. Right.
yeah. So, ready to move on to Israel?
Yeah, I think that's all I've got on the Iran thing. We'll obviously, if anything big and interesting happens with that other tanker that's still sort of floating around there in limbo, we will, update and cover that. But for now, that it does seem like that oil is sort of destined for the custody of the U.S. government,
Yep.
or that gasoline, excuse me.
All right. So, just to wrap up today's show, we have some news on Israel and what the U.S. Congress is doing in response to, I guess, kind of the Trump administration signing the Abraham Accords, which are Israel's agreements with the UAE and Bahrain to normalize relations. And it seems in response there's been at least a little bit of a quid pro quo, if not direct bad seen deals that say this will open both the UAE and Bahrain up to receiving the U.S. made Lockheed made F-35. And this is a big deal for Israel because Israel demands having, and U.S. members of Congress also demand that Israel has what they call a qualitative military edge, which means Israel is supposed to have more U.S. military weapons and more advanced military weapons than all of their Arab neighbors. And so if Israel has F-35s, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they're supposed to have like F-15s or F-16s, less advanced versions of those, different kinds of fighter and weapon systems and stuff like that. So this has this with the possible sale of F-35s coming up at times, Netanyahu has openly pushed back, and the Israel government has openly pushed back against this. Although it's kind of seemed as it's progressed forward that those F-35s were probably pretty critical to the UAE, at least in Bahrain, signing the Abraham Accords, and so it seems that those countries are going to probably get offered at least some F-35s in the near future. And so the most Israel friendly people in Congress like Representative Elliot Engel, Bob Menendez, and Jim Rich have all kind of taken different steps to try to empower Israel in some way to either have more advanced weapons and to maintain that edge, or even more disturbing, as Dave DeCamp is now writing at antiwar.com, there different members of Congress are introducing a bipartisan bill to give Israel veto powers over U.S. arms sales to different countries in the Middle East. And so, uh, maybe this isn't a terrible thing, Will, because we aren't necessarily a big fan of these massive arms sales to the Middle East, and somebody having veto power and being able to stop them isn't a terrible thing. But how is it that's the government of Israel most likely to do that? The U.S. Congress has been trying to stop, Trump selling weapons to Saudi Arabia that are used to slaughter Yemenis for a couple of years now, and that gets to go through. But it seems like the only country that may, or only really entity that may have the power to block any U.S. weapon sales at this point, if this bill goes through, at least, will be Israel. So what a policy this is, Will, and how is it that Israel ends up with such a prestigious and position in the U.S. government that, in a time where people are hyperventilating over, foreign influence in U.S. politics, we're going to give Israel control over who we sell our weapons to?
Yeah, yeah. So this whole thing, this especially this bill, is all sort of an outgrowth out of this concept of qualitative military edge, or QME, that they call in regards to Israel. And the U.S. government is basically legally obligated to ensure that Israel keeps that military advantage over its neighbors. This is all spelled out in the Arms Export Control Act, where Congress actually has to certify that arms sales to other countries in the region don't threaten Israel's eternal upper hand and advantage. Um, so this new law, which was introduced by a Democrat, Brad Schneider, I think, from Illinois, but as you might expect, with anything related to Israel, it often has bipartisan support. But under this new law, it basically just takes that certification process that Congress has to do, and it effectively hands it to Israel itself. Um, and the bill, it doesn't literally give Israel a veto power over the sales, but what it does do is it requires the White House to get together with their Israeli counterparts and Israeli officials to hear about how a particular arms sale might affect their edge. And then the White House has to then report that back to Congress, and then Congress is the one who certifies. And they might certify on the basis of that Israeli consulting and advice or whatever. And so you can imagine that these decisions will pretty much always go in Israel's favor if they're always allowed such a say in it. They're always allowed to really characterize how this will affect them. They can just say, "Oh, woe is us. This arms sale will totally destroy our military edge," and then that'll be it. And then Congress will not certify that thing. As if it already isn't the case that this is already in effect what happens. I mean, the Israelis effectively get whatever they want. However, you were correct in the way you framed this. I think the bill does specifically mention these recent agreements between the Israelis and the Emiratis and Bahrain. And the bill even kind of implies that the U.S. may sell those Arab states advanced weapons like the F-35 someday, without saying it directly. It kind of just hints at that. So clearly, I think the bill has pretty much everything to do with those recent normalization deals between Israel and these Arab countries. It's basically saying that we will forever play favorites with the Israelis, no matter what. No matter how much Israel makes friends with people in the region, we will still always see them as the favorite child. And another thing you pointed out here too is I guess if the effect of this is that the U.S. will sell fewer weapons because the Israelis are basically vetoing these sales. I'm not really opposed to that. I'm fine with the U.S. handing out fewer, weapons of destruction to oppressive states around the world. But I do just kind of find it ridiculous to hand the Israelis this much sway and influence over our decision making, over U.S. decision making, especially when we're already so in bed with them already, and we fully endorse and support all their policies against the Palestinians, the occupation, the violence. Uncle Sam's name is on all of that already, and so just to get even more in bed with them like this, I think is not the right direction to be heading into. We hand them billions and billions of dollars every year that they don't even need, that I think even Israeli think tanks and stuff have said that this is not necessary to have. These are tax dollars that are stolen from American workers and families and stuff. Largely, they're funneled into arms manufacturers. The overall U.S. relationship with Israel is just insane. And I don't want to see that kind of trend continue, which is exactly what this bill would do. And like this whole qualitative military edge thing is just kind of like whack to me in the first place. And this bill just takes that to like a very nauseating level, like of absolute obsequiousness of like, we'll do whatever you want, Israel. Just tell us, give us our marching orders.
Yeah, I think you really nailed it there, Will. That's the problem is just how much control they have in our government, and this isn't meant to come off as like a conspiracy thing. It's right there in
Right.
front for everybody to see, and the official platform and policy of the two major parties. Trump talks constantly about how friendly he is to Israel, and Joe Biden does the best he can to not be outdone by Trump and say they have our undying support, and we'll no, nobody talks about, of course, the most important thing to talk about when it comes to Israel really has nothing to do with the state of Israel, just stopping their oppression of the Palestinians by not supporting it. Especially with the $3.8 billion at the very least of military aid that we get to Israel every year. And this is a wealthy state that I think, at least the, Jewish people of the country are entitled to free healthcare and education. I mean, we obviously know the Palestinians don't get all of that, but there is a
Right.
huge segment of that population who gets a ton of welfare. And at least you had to wonder if the U.S. didn't give them $3.8 billion every year, could they then, subsidize their healthcare, with free stuff because they're not putting that money towards their military like they would need to, or something like that. Or if
Exactly.
Israel would maybe find out that it's not so advantageous to have such an aggressive foreign policy, without the U.S. constantly, asserting that they're going to intervene and pouring, billions of military dollars into Israel's coffers. Maybe without all that, they had to say, well, as bad as, the Iranians are and we hate the Ayatollahs and the Persians are terrible or whatever they want to believe, maybe they'll say, well, they don't have nuclear weapons right now. And so, things like the JCPOA are actually good. That way we don't have to spend a ton of money on our military, check Iran, because we know the Iranians are checked by this deal. But man, anyways,
Yeah, no,
Will,
I was going to say, I absolutely agree. I think the U.S. support absolutely emboldens all of their very worst policies, all their most hawkish and all their bluster against the Palestinians and Iran. Absolutely. All that stuff does just completely underwrite it. And all money is fungible. So, yeah, giving them money for their military does allow them to save funds to, subsidize their own healthcare and stuff. And so, are American taxpayers paying for Israeli socialist healthcare when, like, when a leftist in here in the U.S. are complaining that, like, we don't have anything close to that? Not that you and I really want that, but it is sort of like, you can just see how the optics of this look, that we're subsidizing their socialist healthcare system. Yeah, we don't have that here, like we don't
right.
have those same benefits.
And just a little bit of attacking the right from the right for those who are, concerned about debt and, welfare and stuff like that. Why should we
Yeah.
support that in another country if you don't support that here? Especially in a year with the pandemic where I think we've wrapped up trillions of dollars in deficit already. So, let's save money where we can. Let's cut foreign aid. And it seems that Rand Paul may be the only person in Congress that's usually at all interested in doing that. And of
Yeah.
course, that all this aid is specifically meant to be unconditional. That it's not that Israel has to, respect human rights or anything like that. It's the U.S. will, no matter what, give Israel $3.8 billion a year, no strings attached, nothing like that. And to have
It's
that be the have to be policy that if you're pro Israel, you're pro unconditional money. It's just crazy that that's like kind of the political standard.
yeah. Last thing I'll say here too is it's really shady too. If you read like Walton Mearsheimer, the Israel lobby, how some of this stuff works, like some of these so-called grants are supposed to be loans. They make them as loans and then they like figure out ways to waive them, paying them back. And so a lot of the time they are just getting, like, I don't know, they're supposed to pay it back, but they figure out some loophole to where they don't have to. So,
Right.
go figure.
Just like I'm sure all these COVID loans that they gave out, I doubt any of these big
Yeah,
businesses will be paying them back. All
yeah.
right, Will, let's just remind the folks where they can find the show. You are at the Will Porter on Twitter. I'm at Kyle Anzalone _ On Twitter, the show is at con _ interest. On Facebook, you find the show Conflicts of Interest. There's a page. YouTube, the show is Conflicts of Interest. We're well over 100 subscribers at this point, and it's going up every day. So be sure to take the time to subscribe to the show. And I really recommend to watch it there because I think that's where the show's at its absolute best. But of course, it's on all the different podcast feeds now. I believe it's up everywhere but iHeartRadio. So if you're an iHeartRadio podcast listener, and just keep listening under the Foreign Policy Focus feed. If not, they should all be under the Conflicts of Interest feed. Once you subscribe to the new feed, make sure you give it a rating and review. 5 stars, we really appreciate it. Tell people why you like the show. In the past week, I've had a few of you hit me up on Twitter or Facebook to tell me that you really like the show. And I really appreciate that. It gives me so much energy to keep doing this thing because I know people are listening and liking it. So thanks everybody for the support. Just keep sharing it and putting it out there to more people. Me and Will are always looking for ways to make the content better. We do have a Patreon page, patreon.com/conflicts of interest. Feel free to, sign up there. But we are looking at different ways to, get people a little bit more motivated to give us money there too. So if you got any suggestions on what we could do for some bonus content, let us know. And we'll be back with another show later this week. Will, thanks.
Thanks, Kyle. Bye, everybody.